What's up, AP Psych? Welcome back. We are now moving on to our new unit on personality. We're going to discuss 4 different types of personality and how we test, have projective and objective tests to discover our personality types and things that go into them and the different theories behind it all. But we're going to start with one of the original psychologists we all know, Sigmund Freud, and his psychoanalytic perspective of psychology. And we'll also touch on some psychodynamic theorists as well, and they're kind of like the Neo-Freudians. They've updated his theories and improved upon them a little bit in the more recent years. So let's begin. So in his clinical practice, Freud encountered patients suffering from nervous disorders, right? We'd call those anxiety disorders today. And they could not be explained in terms of a purely physical cause. So he's thinking, okay, there must be something going on inside the mind. How can I figure this out? So he referred to this as hysteria and said there had to be a psychological cause for the ailments he was seeing. So as a result of this, he develops the first comprehensive personality theory ever, right? So we can credit Freud with that. This is where the psychoanalytic perspective is going to come from. And he's going to focus mostly on the unconscious mind, trying to get into people's unconscious motivations for their behaviors and their decisions. So he, like I said, focused on the unconscious mind, this big reservoir or holding tank of what he thought were mostly unacceptable thoughts, wishes, feelings, and memories. So he thought our unconscious mind was driven by these sexual and aggressive urges that we had to somehow come to grips with. And so to uncover the unconscious mind and these things that were driving our behavior and our personality, Freud asked patients to say whatever would come to their mind to tap their unconscious. So his famous couch, he'd have patients lay down, he would ask them questions, he would say, I'm going to give you a list of terms, I want you to say the first thing that comes to your mind when I say this word. He called that free association, and he thought that was a great way to tap into the unconscious and just have it reveal itself in treatment form. And that is psychoanalysis, essentially, right? Free association is a type of psychoanalysis. This led to painful, embarrassing, unconscious memories coming up for his patients. But once those memories were retrieved and released, they could treat it, and the patient would feel better having discussed it and come to grips with some of those motivations and thoughts and feelings that they were experiencing. So as his psychoanalytic perspective developed, Freud was focused mostly on the unconscious mind. And a great way to remember this is this iceberg idea. So our conscious mind is what's the tip of the iceberg, right? What you are currently aware of, what you're currently thinking about right now. Then you have your preconscious. This is information not in our conscious, but it is retrievable as you need it. Okay, so for example, it's like memories, things you can pull up, things you remember, things you've experienced that are there that you can reach. So if I said, think about the first time you rode a bike. Right? You weren't thinking about that. It wasn't in your conscious mind, but now it is because you pulled it from your preconscious. It's there. You can access it. What Freud wanted to focus mostly on was the unconscious, this massive part of the iceberg, the biggest part of our mind. It's out of our awareness, out of our consciousness. We can't pull it up, yet it can dictate our behavior. And that's where he said those sexual and aggressive urges were coming from that were dictating our behavior and changing our personality. So some unconscious influences. We talked about dreams back in States of Consciousness. We talked about latent content of dreams and how there's symbolic meaning of our dream images. Freud believed in this heavily, right? He said that these dreams and these symbolic images are revealing our unconscious mind to us. So when we talked about consciousness, we talked about manifest content, what you actually see in your dream, and the latent content, what those symbols mean. So he worked to try to determine what the actual things you're seeing in your dream, what the latent content of those were, what the symbolic meaning of those images were. In addition to, psychoanalysis, free association, dream analysis, he also introduced the idea of a Freudian slip. This would be like slips of the tongue that Freud believed were our true unconscious thoughts surfacing. So when you say something you don't mean to say, or something inappropriate that slips out, but you didn't mean to say it that way, Freud would say, that wasn't a mistake. That's our unconscious mind bubbling to the surface. Okay? So for example, you got the president here, and his secretary, "I'm sorry, Mr. President, I meant bird flu strategy, not bird-brained strategy," right? Inferring that she thinks the president's an idiot, but that wasn't what she meant to say. Freud would say, it is. That was a Freudian slip in your unconscious mind coming to the surface. So, how does all this work into personality development? Well, Freud believed that personality formed during life's first few years, and it was divided into these psychosexual stages of development. So this is where Freud's theories get a little bit out there, because he's focusing on the first few years and those sexual and aggressive urges, right, of the unconscious mind that he thinks are what drives our decisions and our personality. So during these stages, we're going to talk about in a little bit something called the id, ego, and superego. But he would say the id's pleasure-seeking energies, the I want it now portion of our personality, focuses on pleasure-sensitive body areas called erogenous zones, and this is how our personality develops through these psychosexual stages as we grow. So let's get through these stages. So first, psychosexual stage, the oral stage from 0 to 1. You obtain pleasure from the mouth via sucking, biting, swallowing. This is why children want to put everything in their mouth. They love their pacifiers, they love their bottles, things like that. And they gain confidence from, exploring that part of their anatomy. As you move and get older, eventually you transition into the anal stage of the psychosexual development. And this is from the years of about 1 to 3. And you obtain pleasure by learning how to control your bodily waste. So he's thinking about, okay, these kids are trying to learn how to appropriately go to the restroom. And as they do that, they gain pleasure from that and understanding from that, and they grow from that, and their personality develops as they do that. Continuing in the psychosexual stages from 3 to 6, you have Phallic. This is, according to Freud, the most crucial stage of personality development, where you become curious about your genitalia and deal with incestuous feelings. So this is where Freud really gets out there a little bit, and there's been some pushback on these stages, obviously. But there are these ideas that, you're learning about yourself physically. And then he said that these incestuous feelings that you have are termed the Oedipus complex for young boys and the Electra complex. So if you've never heard the story of Oedipus, it's an old Greek mythology, but he was born into the family of a king, and the oracle told the king that his son would kill him one day. So he sent Oedipus. When Oedipus was born, he tied his hands and feet, put him on the side of a mountain to die. But he was found by a shepherd, raised by the shepherd, and grew to adulthood. When he grew to adulthood, he was on the road back to the city where he was born. Unknowingly, he crossed the path of his father on the way, and they got into an argument, and he kills his father. When he gets to the city, he outsmarts something called the Sphinx, and as a result, the people of the city want to make him king. He becomes king, and they offer him to marry the queen. Little did he know the queen was his wife, the queen was his mother, and they end up having kids and things like that. And when they find out that he's married his mother kills herself, and it's this whole big issue, right? So this Oedipus complex, Freud took that story, and he says through this phallic stage, the young boy has this unconscious desire for their mom and a jealous hatred for their dad. And they fear punishment if their dad finds out about these feelings. So they hide them, but this is why, they would say some people are a mama's boy at the age of 3 to 6 or something like that, or a daddy's girl. The Electra complex is the opposite. It's the female version of the Oedipus complex. This was later added by a psychologist we'll talk about in a few minutes, Karen Horney, and Freud's daughter, Anna, who obviously Sigmund Freud had a large impact on her life and her theories. So as you move through this stage, you get pleasure from discovering more about yourself. You have a desire for the opposite sex parent and a fear of the other parent finding out about that. Interesting. So the end of the phallic stage, you kind of start identifying with the same sex parent. So Freud would say that children cope with these threatening feelings by repressing them, which is a defense mechanism we'll discuss, and by identifying with the rival parent. Basically, like, if you can't beat them, join them, right? So through this process of identification, the superego, which we'll get into, which is like the moral side of your reasoning, gains strength incorporating that parent's values. So instead of pushing that parent away and being fearful of them, you start to identify that with them and do the things that they do, and you want to be like them. So as young boys get older, they want to be like their father, and as young girls get older, they want to be like their mother. Things like that is what Freud would say, and how our personality develops through the phallic stage. Eventually, from 6 to 12, you hit the latent stage. This is like middle school, where you suppress sexual interest and you play mostly with your same-sex peers. You can think about this in middle school. Everybody thinks the other sex has cooties. You want to stay away. You make fun of each other, and you only hang out with your friends, right, of the same sex. As you get older, you move through the latent stage, and you end up 12 and up at the genital stage, and this is adult sexuality, right? And this is where you express sexual feelings towards others and your desire for that. Okay, don't confuse the genital stage with the phallic stage. Phallic is 3 to 6, Freud's most important stage of development, where you're discovering more about yourself. The genital stage is adult sexuality and looking for relationships moving forward. So that's Freud's theory of psychosexual stages and how those help develop our personality at different points. As you move through those stages, you may become what Freud termed fixated, and this is where the impact on your personality comes into play. If a traumatic event occurs, one can become stuck in that particular stage of development. Okay? So just a couple examples. If you become fixated or you can't resolve the issues at the oral stage, you might seek excessive oral contact through smoking, drinking, eating, right? You might become dependent, either passive or biting sarcasm, or you act tough. These could be people in adulthood who do these things. They might have become fixated, or some traumatic event may have happened at that stage of their life from 0 to 1 in the oral stage. Another example of fixation in the anal stage, there's 2 types here. If you have some type of traumatic event, you could become anal retentive. And this is like super type A people, really organized, orderly. They have to have things done their way. That could be you. Or you could become anal expulsive, not explosive, expulsive, where you become messy and disorganized and life's kind of chaotic for you, right? So depending on the traumatic event that occurs, you could go one of 2 ways in the anal stage. So those are just some examples of how the fixations, the traumatic events that occur that make you stuck in a stage can have an impact on your later personality, according to Freud. Okay, so let's talk about the id, ego, and superego, just to define that real quick. I touched on it a little bit, but the id unconsciously strives to satisfy our basic sexual and aggressive drives, operating on what's called the pleasure principle. This is where we demand immediate gratification. This is like the I want it now syndrome. Okay. So the id could be, in cartoons, it's often displayed as like the devil on your shoulder, right? To do this now because it will be pleasurable. It will benefit you immediately. Do this. Then you have in the middle, the ego, which is you yourself, your conscious mind. It functions as like the executive and the mediator. And it kind of, goes back and forth between what the id wants and the superego wants, and it has to make the decision about what's right. Okay? And it operates on the reality principle. Okay. Pleasure principle from the id, I want it now. Moral principle from the superego, and the ego has to say, all right, well, what can I actually do in this situation? What's actually making sense? What can I actually achieve? Okay. So superego is the angel on your shoulder. This provides our standards for judgment and for our future aspirations. So it thinks down the road, it thinks more morally, more logically, and it operates on the moral principle. Okay. So you have immediate gratification, the pleasure principle, versus the moral principle, and your ego has to make the decision. It has to be the reality principle in between. So as you can imagine, there can be some conflicts, some serious conflicts between the id and superego, especially as you develop and within your personality trying to make decisions. So in order to mediate and solve those anxiety-inducing conflicts between the id and the superego, the devil and the angel, your ego unconsciously protects itself, and it has these defense mechanisms that help with that. And we're going to go over the defense mechanisms that your ego has to help you get through these tough, anxious situations. Now, they're only really unhealthy when they start causing self-defeating behavior or lead to emotional problems. So defense mechanisms are a good thing for your ego to mediate and get through the anxiousness, unless it leads to um, laziness, different um, potentially emotional disorders that can be crippling or debilitating, or other behaviors that are negative as a result. So some examples. First up, we have repression. This is where we avoid painful thoughts by forcing them into the back of our mind. Okay? This kind of underlines all of our defense mechanisms, and we all repress certain thoughts or certain memories. It can be basic things, or it can be more intense, traumatic things that we're trying to repress. But just one example, you witness a murder, and it was so brutal. You're like, I can't think about this. You push it to the back of your mind, and almost forget about it. So when the police ask you about it, you can't remember the details because you've pushed it so far back. Okay. A more light example, when you have a test and you're like, I'll study for that the next day. I'll study for that on Wednesday. I'll study for that on Thursday. All of a sudden it's Friday and it's test day, and you repress that because you didn't want to think about it so much. You wanted to procrastinate, and now you're not ready for it because you almost forgot about it. Okay, so that's repressing a painful thought. Then you have regression. This is when we retreat to behaving or thinking like a child in order to avoid adult issues. We've all done this before, right? You throw a temper tantrum when you don't get what you want. Okay, think about the last time, you stomped away from your parents and slammed your door, or they told you to do something and you said, "You're ruining my life," and you throw this temper tantrum, and it's like you're going back to being a 4 or 5-year-old again, right? That's how you're handling the situation. Instead of handling it like an adult, you regress and you go backwards. Okay. Next up, we have displacement. This is where we take those sexual or aggressive impulses that are inappropriate and we displace them to a more acceptable, less threatening person or object. Okay? So displacement would be, for example, you get angry at your mom. You can't take it out on her, so you take out that anger on the family dog. You displace your anger to something else. Okay? Your boss gets upset at you, so you take it out on your family. Your mom gets upset at you, you take it out on your friend or your little sister or something like that. The key part is with displacement, you take your anger and you express it on something less threatening, an object or a person. Okay, so then we have projection. And this is where we disguise our threatening impulses by attributing them to others. So think about a projector, right? It takes an image and it projects it onto or pushes it out onto something else, right? That's exactly what projection is. So let's say you wanted to break up with your girlfriend or boyfriend, but you don't have the guts to do it. So instead, you project and you accuse them of wanting to break up with you, and that precipitates the breakup. Okay? Or, it's gym class. You say, no one wants me on their team. I'm just going to leave. But in reality, you're not confident about your abilities, but you're projecting your thoughts onto others. Okay, so that's projection. Then we have sublimation. This tends to be one of the more healthy defense mechanisms. We expend our energy on pro-social activities in order to avoid undesirable activities. Okay, so let's say you have a penchant or a liking to hit things, to cause damage or something like that. So instead of doing that to inappropriate things or other people or getting in fights at school, you take up boxing as a hobby, right? Okay. Or you like violence and physical contact, so you become a linebacker on the football team. Okay. Things like that. You take those urges that you have that are not socially appropriate and you put them into something that is. Okay? That's sublimation. It's a positive one. And you have reaction formation. This is where we make unacceptable impulses into their opposite acceptable form. Okay, so you really hate your psych teacher, right? You think he's not funny, stupid, not a helpful teacher, doesn't know what he's talking about. But you can't tell everyone that because it's kind of unacceptable to talk down about your teachers. So you tell everyone how much you love them, but in reality, you dislike them. Okay, this is kind of like being kind of two-faced. You say something to people, but you really feel another. But that protects you from having to share your unacceptable thoughts. Okay. Last two, we have rationalization. We all rationalize. We try to create logical explanations for our behavior in order to justify it. So one thing I'm rationalizing right now, I haven't graded your guys' most recent FRQs yet. And I keep telling myself it's because my wife and I are looking to buy a house. And I just keep putting it off. I'm saying I got bigger, more important things to do. but I need to get it done, right? I'm rationalizing. I need to grade those and get them back to you. Or, you want to go to the movies with a friend, so you justify going instead of studying for the exam you need to study for by stating that you would have failed anyway, right? You're rationalizing. I would have failed anyway, so I don't need to study. I can go to the movies, right? Our last one is denial. We refuse to perceive reality in order to protect ourselves from it. Okay? So a good example there that many of you may be coming coming in contact with soon, hopefully not. But you get a rejection letter from a college of your choice, a college that you really wanted to go to. It happens to us all, right? You can't get into every school. But you wanted to go there so bad that you still tell everyone that's where you're going. You're like, yep, I move in August 20th. I'll see you guys later. But you can't face the facts. You're in denial that you didn't get accepted to your dream school. All right, so that wraps up kind of like Freud's base theories of personality and how our personality develops and how our personality mediates conflicts between the id, ego, and superego, right? So now we're going to touch on very quickly the Neo-Freudians. These are the psychodynamicists from the first slide. They built upon Freud's theories and really took the emphasis off of the sexual and aggressive urges and still talked about the unconscious mind, but they kind of changed it more to social instead of sexual issues. So our first of the three is Alfred Adler, and he believed in childhood tension, like Freud. However, these tensions were social in nature and not sexual. So he wouldn't focus on the psychosexual stages. He would focus on social issues in development of your personality. So he would say a child struggles with an inferiority complex as they grow and develop, and they're striving for superiority and power. So in childhood, you're learning things, you feel inferior to the older children or the adults around you, and you want to grow so you can become superior or at least match those people in terms of their knowledge and social prowess. So you're trying to overcome this inferiority complex, according to Alfred Adler. In addition to Adler, just like him, you have Karen Horney, who believed in the social aspects of childhood growth and development. And she said, instead of the inferiority complex, children are trying to overcome a sense of helplessness, which is somewhat similar in the way that children feel like they can't do things on their own. They're trying to overcome this helplessness as they learn and they grow and their personality develops, just like they're trying to overcome that inferiority complex that Adler talked about. She countered some of Freud's assumptions about women and the sexual and aggressive urges that he placed on them. And he would have argued that women have weak superegos. She pushed back on that, said, no, that's crap. And he also argued kind of with the Electra complex that women suffer from penis envy, which is essentially wanting to be male and being jealous of the fact that, of being a man. And she pushed back on that, said, that's crap. Let's focus on the social issues that children are experiencing, not these psychosexual issues that Freud came up with. And finally, we have Carl Jung. And Jung has some interesting ideas about unconscious mind, and particularly something called the collective unconscious. And he argued this contained a common reservoir of images derived from our species past. So as human beings, we all have this collective unconscious that we pull from in these ideas. And those ideas reveal themselves in the form of archetypes, according to Jung. And they're this universal symbolic images that appear across cultures. So he said we notice these things across Eastern, Western, myths, art, stories, dreams from different areas of the world. They all have these similar themes. So that's where he developed this idea of the collective unconscious. Some of those similar themes you'd notice would be good versus evil, right? Heroes versus villains. All of these different societies and cultures have these stories, good overcoming, things like that. He said that's because we have a collective unconscious as human beings. So thinking about these psychoanalytic perspective and the psychodynamicists and their theories of personality and how it develops, how do we assess that unconscious mind in order to understand the personality? So they evaluated personality from a psychological instrument known as a projective test. And they argued that these projective tests would reveal the hidden unconscious mind. So when we talk about personality theory, we'll talk about two tests, projective and objective. Okay? We're going to start with the projective side of things. So these projective tests, two of the most common used are the thematic apperception test and the Rorschach Inkblot. So the thematic apperception test was developed by Henry Murray. It's a projective test in which people express their inner feelings and interests through stories they make up about an ambiguous scene. So they would ask someone to look at a picture and tell a story about what they think is happening. And that would reveal their unconscious mind and thoughts and an insight into their personality. Here's just some examples of TATs that they would show people and have them write stories about, and see what they come up with. Just a couple other examples of things you might write about or things you'd see and be asked to write about. And we'll do some of these in class just to get an idea. We'll projectively assess your personality. So the second one is the Rorschach Inkblot test. This was the most widely used projective test. You get a set of 10 inkblots, just like something here, designed by Herman Rorschach. And it seeks to identify people's inner feelings by analyzing their interpretation of the blots. Okay, what do you see in the blot? Can you tell me what you're looking at? What's your interpretation? You're not telling a story. It's just talking about what you see. And that gives insight into your unconscious mind. So with each theory of personality we discuss, we're going to talk about pros and cons of each, right? So some projective test criticisms. Critics do argue that projective tests lack both reliability and validity, okay? Because even trained raters and psychological experts evaluate the same patient and they come up with different interpretations, right? And that's what makes it projective. It's not an objective score that you're receiving. Someone is interpreting your interpretation and then trying to diagnose you based upon that or talk about your personality based upon that. So it's going to change with the people that you're interacting with. Two psychologists are going to come up with two different interpretations of your projective tests. So that's a reliability issue, right? It's not easily rated, right? There's rating issues. And then we have projective tests may misdiagnose a normal individual as a pathological individual or someone who has a mental disorder, right? And that comes down to the validity. Is it predicting what it's supposed to? Are we consistently identifying mental disorders based upon these projective tests? And the answer oftentimes is no to that. So there are a couple legitimate criticisms involved with projective tests and in general, the psychoanalytic theory of personality, because there is so little, scientific backing and research-based evidence to support it. Okay, so that's the biggest criticism about projective tests and psychoanalytic perspective. And that's why it's still used today, but it's one that's not taken as seriously potentially as other theories of personality as a result. Okay, so that wraps up our psychoanalytic, psychodynamic theories of personality. As always, we'll see you in class. We'll do some activities. And if you have any questions, please let me know.